I think we should get started. This is Howard Kunruther. I am delighted to welcome all of you to the webinar that the Wharton Risk Management and Decision Process Center is hosting on mitigation and insurance of wildfires. An area that all of you are very familiar with, given what has been happening recently, particularly here in California. I wanted to indicate that we really are very fortunate to have 5 expert panelists who are going to provide their views on these issues. And I thought it would be useful to get started with a little brief presentation by myself on risk center activities that have been going on in the last year. With risk management solutions has been an important part of that, and give you a little background or context for the expertise that you're going to hear from our panelists. So I'm going to share the screen right now and start the presentation here, and hopefully everyone will be able to see this. Am I correct on that? No problem. Good. I see a couple of hands have gone up, so I assume I can proceed. As you already know, this is an issue on mitigating and insuring wildfires. There will be several other people who will be talking about the wildfires in California. This is just one slide that highlights essentially the challenges that were faced in 2020, and it's almost as bad, if not going to be worse, in 2021. We have more and more severe wildfires that have occurred, and climate change is going to make things worse in the future. What we did with Risk Management Solutions, and my colleague Mark Pauly is co-author of that, and we had several research assistants from computer science who helped develop a simulation that I'll be showing a few slides from in a moment. We actually took a community in California, Fountain Grove, where they had a fire in 2017. You can see the community before the fire, and here you can see the community after the fire. And we wanted to understand essentially the role that mitigation and insurance might play, as well as understanding how people might have perceived the risk. Let's start with the homeowner's decision on not to mitigate their house. And we don't know this as a fact, but we have a lot of evidence that suggests this is the way often people make the decisions. That they basically, before essentially the Tubbs fire, they didn't think that Fountain Grove would have a fire in the next few years. They didn't focus on the long-term benefits of mitigation. They may have seen their neighbors and found they hadn't invested in mitigation. Why should they do so? And most important, the homeowners did not consider the risk of damage not only to their house, but from an outside fire, but that it might spread from nearby houses. And that's going to be a very important concept in terms of how one looks at the wildfire problem. Now let's take a look at insurers, and we're going to hear a good deal about insurers from our panelists today. The insurers obviously need data to quantify the premium reductions for any kind of parcel level or community-based mitigation efforts. Insurers need the data on the mitigation proportion, the number of houses that actually are mitigated, since their risk of their spreading actually depends on that. They're responsible for covering fire losses to the houses they insure, whether or not the damage comes from external sources. And that's actually important. Even if it turns out that they're protected, if the fire is spread from another house, they're going to have to cover that damage. They may be required to offer coverage to homes in the WUI, the Wildfire Urban Interface, and they have difficulty convincing homeowners that premiums are risk-based. That's always a challenge that one faces. One of the areas that we thought it would be important to look at in the context of this is the interdependency problem. And the interdependency problem goes something like this. The Los Angeles Times actually had an article in this that highlighted that. The fires that spread from house to house generate a force of their own. The embers, broadcast by the wind, find dry leaves, igniting one structure then another, and the cycle is perpetuated block after block. Break that cycle and the fire quits and destruction can be minimized. And so our question really in the research that we were doing, where we worked with the data from Risk RMS, is how do you break that cycle by investing in mitigation? Well, let me give you a very quick summary of what we found in the context of the simulation that we ran. And this is just, again, a hypothetical set of homes, 100 houses where the property ranged from 100,000 to over $1 million. There was wildfire resistance of these homes if they were mitigated, and then 50% of the damage would be, 50% of the value of the home would be damaged by fire. If it was unmitigated, it would be 75%. And here's kind of what we actually found. We found the following: the percentage of the damage from the primary source, from the external source, can be shown depending on the percentage of homes that mitigated, ranging from 0 to 100%. Obviously, if all of them mitigate, it's all going to come from an outside source. But if none of them mitigate, you can see a very large proportion, almost half of it. In fact, half of it actually comes from the risk spreading from one house to another. And that obviously gets decreased as more and more houses mitigate. If you look at the cost of mitigation as on top of these the cost of actually investing in mitigation, as well as the costs of the fires, you can see then that the optimal number of homes that should be mitigated may not be 100% if you look at the cost and benefits, and they may be 75% in this particular case. But we also emphasize that people may not make the decisions the way you would like them to make it, and so there may very well be even a more important role for the community to play as a part of this. And let me highlight, just to conclude this brief presentation, with respect to how some California communities have done exactly that. San Diego has brush clearance regulations, and they require a whole set of actions. I won't go through them here in clearing brush and vegetation. Redding has an extensive history with wildfires. The Carr fire in 2018 led to these measures, and that's one of the behavioral characteristics that we know about. It's a past experience that makes a difference in terms of what communities and individuals might do. They have a code now. They require ignition resistant construction materials and open space management. Montecito is a great example of a community that actually addressed the need to mitigate after experienced the 1990 Painted Cave fire that destroyed 427 homes in their community. They worked with their residents. They hardened their homes against embers. They replaced the sidings and roofs with less flammable materials. And I know you'll hear about that. I know Royster Wright will be talking a bit about some of those mitigation measures. And the impact of these measures there were no injuries, and only 7 homes were lost in the Thomas fire, which is a very severe fire in 2017. And the one I'll end with is a new community. It's just getting started in Southern California. It's implemented wildfire mitigations for all of their homes. Combustible vegetation has been replaced with fire-resistant plants. Construction materials are non-combustible, and there are automatic fire sprinklers were mandatory. So there's a real opportunity and challenge for new homes to mitigate. So let me just end with a couple of points, and I know there'll be some comments that will be made by our panelists on some of these points. We have to model the primary and secondary losses, not just the primary losses. Secondary losses are really important here based on at least these simulations that we have done with RMS. Incorporate climate change. That's an obvious one. We all are aware of that from what we've been hearing and seeing in the newspapers and on videos. Consider the impact of regulations and standards in reducing community wildfire losses. Critical question: what's the insurer's role in providing coverage against wildfires? Something we will be discussing. We should address the biases so homeowners undertake mitigation measures. And finally, consider the impact of financial incentives on encouraging investment in mitigation and what impact that might have on property values, something you'll be hearing about at the end of our talk by Michael Wara. So let me introduce our panelists here. You all know who they are from the announcement of this. You can read essentially what their background is. I'm just going to indicate how the order in which they're going and give you a little guidelines on how we'll be proceeding. Rob Reeder will be starting off from Guy Carpenter. Roy Wright will be following him, the Institute for Business, Home and Safety. Michael Young from Risk Management Solutions will follow Roy. Rex Frazier who's really with the Personal Federation of California, and Michael Wara, who's directs the Climate and Energy Policy Program at Woods Hole. all of them have really been thinking about this problem in over the years, really, and have done extremely pioneering research. So I feel honored to be able to moderate this whole program, because I think there's going to be a great deal of learning that will take place. So let me end by just giving you some of the guidelines on how we're going to be proceeding. Each of the panelists, we're going to be speaking for about 10 minutes on their thoughts with respect to the wildfire problem. We'll go through all of them before we have any open discussion, but that'll leave us hopefully about a half hour to have all of your questions and questions answered. Not all of them. We hope that there are a number of questions. I'll be trying to find questions for the panelists to address, and and you should put all of these questions in the Q&A box in on your screen, which will then be looked at as a basis for doing all of this. And we'll turn to those after the presentations. So that's basically a quick introduction to this. I'm looking forward to hearing all the panelists, and I'm going to turn the screen over to Rob Reeder, and he'll get us started, and we'll just go through the 5 panelists one by one. So look forward to it. Thanks again for all of you attending.
Thank you, Howard, and many thanks to the Wharton Risk Center for the ability to come and speak to all of you today. Let me just go ahead and get my screen up. So as Howard indicated, today's session is on mitigating and insuring wildfires. I'm going to focus on the insuring aspect of things, and I know you'll hear a lot from colleagues and other panelists in relationship to the mitigation portion of things. I've really prepared 4 sections very briefly to move through them in the 10 minutes we have. 1 is talking about the wildfire peril. 2 is talking about the construction of the insurance, reinsurance, and capital market food chain that essentially serves to provide protection for the wildfire peril, some of the things that go into underwriting decisions, and then how risk mitigation and catastrophe modeling can help out in regards to improving decisions for insurability. First, in regards to the wildfire peril, we've just listed a few things here in relationship to them becoming more frequent, more widespread and impactful, becoming longer in terms of duration, less predictable. All of these items present significant issues in relationship to the insurer and reinsurer perspective of wildfires. Years ago, wildfires were considered an incidental peril. They then became a secondary peril in the late 1990s, or right around the 2003 Cedar Fire. And now they've become really a primary peril. But the other thing that needs to keep in perspective in relationship to insurers and reinsurers responding is the fact that wildfire is one of many perils that affects property values and human life around the globe. But I've just listed the fact that there are 17 $1 billion plus insurance losses that have all occurred in the last 12 months between winter storms, convective storms, hurricanes, and wildfires. To give you a perspective in regards to annual average losses that occur, wildfires are actually near the smaller end of either the modeled losses and or the actual losses that occur. Tornado hail events, hurricane events, even winter storms are all larger in terms of the damage they're currently doing. The other thing to remember and understand is that wildfire in the United States is largely a regional peril, mostly west of the Rocky Mountains in relationship to topography, the dryness of the areas of the Western United States, the wind patterns. There's a lot of things that come into play that make the Western United States far more susceptible to wildfires than many other parts. As Howard spoke about elements in relationship to climate change, here is just some indicative patterns. This is where we've categorized in a bar chart in 10-year increments the relative stable precipitation patterns but the continuous increasing of temperature patterns in the United States. And as the temperatures increase and the duration of the heat in terms of the number of months of the year that it extends dries out the land, that's causing a great portion of the problems for the wildfires to occur and be as large as they are. The other things that come into play are wind patterns. Again, as dry climate occurs, heat goes up, there is a direct relationship between the wind speed and the flame length. And the flame length emanating from the wind speed has a great deal to do with the damageability of the properties and or the land that are impaired by a fire. Now to talk a little bit about the insurance and reinsurance food chain, as I'll call it. Prior to 1980, really the insured homeowners and commercial businesses were served by insurance companies who were served by reinsurers. And literally with the advent of the mid to late 1980s, the capital markets, thank goodness, started coming in to actually help play a participatory role in insuring these large catastrophic events. Today, within the reinsurance community, a little bit over 20% of all of the reinsurance business is supported also by the capital markets and Wall Street. And I do envision that growing from the standpoint of the needs of the size of the catastrophes getting larger, the damageability getting worse. We clearly need to have more capital coming in from Wall Street in order to back and insure and protect both citizens and property. When it comes to the underwriting decisions, underwriters really look at the average annual exposed values of an area. So what is that? Well, that's the annual burn probability times the property value calculated at the location. And you can see as we overlay fire patterns of where the damageability is likely to occur, and then also insert the property values within those locations, we're able to discern what the annual expected loss is. Taking California as an example, it's a more difficult situation because California wildfire exposure is highly correlated with the population exposure that is there, and the buildings that are there and the people that are there. And so that's why when you see large wildfire losses occurring in California, you tend to see these larger numbers that we're all accustomed to in terms of the multi-billion-dollar claims. The other thing that we've learned at Guy Carpenter in developing a wildfire risk score and trying to help our clients understand the exposure is that there can be great concentrations between the highest level of risk in an extreme wildfire area being only a couple of miles away from what would on its own, without wind patterns, et cetera, be a low risk area for wildfires. And obviously when the Santa Ana winds blow in Southern California, you can obviously see fires moving very quickly between the most extreme areas and those areas that are deemed less extreme in a very quick manner in terms of timing. Here's just a particular example of a simulation and taking a look at an area in Southern California. In the bottom right-hand side of your corner of your screen, you essentially see the Malibu area. And in the upper left-hand side of the graph, you see Santa Barbara. And you can see different community areas that we've essentially looked at in terms of pockets. And then we've simulated fires in each of these different areas to discern how communities might respond in order to improve underwriting decisions through elements of risk mitigation. We've also utilized things like this to help insurers understand the aggregation of values because they don't want to be overly exposed in any particular area during the course of a simulated fire, or obviously in a worst case scenario, the actual real fire. As a printout that we give to underwriters, if you will, in spreadsheets, we can dynamically run different versions of the models that you'll hear more about today, categorizing risk and aggregation of risk into different areas from the most extreme to the least extreme, helping once again to make sure that no one company has too much risk on its balance sheet to where it can't possibly support the claims that ultimately could be incurred in an area. And essentially, this is a methodology of portfolio underwriting for property business, but also with the losses that have sometimes occurred and the losses of life, you can make estimates on those as well and aggregate them together. So as we look at how risk mitigation can have an impact, here's just a theoretical example as to how things might be done. If a community can take a look at the technical aspect of potential enhancements that they can make with today's models that are continuously getting better and different activities, they can look to model those improvements, make the enhancements, taking a look at them from a cost-benefit analysis on behalf of the citizens or whoever might be paying for the improvements, and then ultimately translate that into an improved estimated loss amount that can then be insured or reinsured by capital backers. And essentially, if you don't get the results that you intend to receive through the process, you can always go back and try and make additional enhancements to then once again make this transfer of risk possible. As another theoretical example in terms of how we look at helping communities in California, most particularly in relationship to things, we've talked with them about buffer zones, where you look at a model domain of a community that's exposed in a high wildfire area, you institute the mitigation efforts to try and build a buffer zone, not necessarily a shield, but just something to help with the protections of the fire. And then actually you simulate ignition risk within the areas outside of the model domain and then determine how much impact you're having. And in the bottom right-hand side, you can see that the communities in green had a far better outcome from the mitigation and buffer zone than those who are in the orange or darker red. But nonetheless, you're able to make improvements, and through those simulated improvements, you can attempt to try and change the dynamics as to how we address wildfire risk in advance. So this concludes my portion of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Roy Wright, who's going to talk to you about his perspective on the issue of wildfire. Roy?
Roy, you're on mute.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you all. You have my screen there in front of you. I want to build this kind of a bit of a tennis game that's going to go back and forth between the insurance dimensions and the mitigation dimensions and build those elements that are there, because the research has come a long way over the last couple, 3 years. And we know that when we're taking on the impacts of wildfire, we need to address things at a parcel level as well as in the surrounding neighborhood and community. A fulsome response involves both of those pieces, because as wildfires play out, it really is 3 concentric circles. We start at the broader landscape ecosystem, you have the neighborhood and community, and ultimately the parcel that is in play. Now, at IBHS, we do everything at full scale, and we look at the elements of studying these, particularly over the last 6 years, where we look at the elements of roofs and how they perform. We have the ability to do things at full scale, to work on embers, and we see how those embers can attack structures, and once you get those ignitions, how fast things can spread. We look at the building characteristics. We look at the elements of, in this instance, a side-by-side of both being attacked by embers, yet the one on the left is the one that is burning in that space, because you've got other approaches that are playing out there on the right. As we work at this, fire suppression crews will get to some homes, but not to all. We can look at the dimensions of how pieces play, in this case, decks, how that fire will ultimately spread. And oftentimes, we think about the highest elements of, 35 to 60 mile an hour winds, but really it's 17 to 30. Plenty of movement can happen in those elements. And we look at all of these various pieces around the home that play out. We think about the sheds that are in the back of our house, where we're storing pieces, and how that will then play and help us understand the overall movement. This is then coupled with work that we do in the field for folks to understand how things will play. Now, what I want to do then is says, well, we know if that's the case, the roof plays a primary role in this stuff. It's the largest open surface for folks to understand and work on these elements. There's work that goes on related to attic vents that are in play, because so many of the embers can come in there. That area right at the base of the structure that will even then wrap around the deck, because again, embers can lodge in those crevices. We look at the 5 feet closest in terms of what's happening from a landscaping perspective. We are looking at elements about what kind of debris and things that would be in that 5 to 30 lane. We look at elements ultimately related to how even the outbuildings are placed and how they should be pushed back. We've looked collectively at these elements so that we can build out what we see from a science perspective, both in the field and in the lab, how each of the individual elements around the home will play. Ultimately, that is in something, and I just want to use it as a way to summarize so much of what is now available from the science, and something that we're calling a wildfire prepared home. There's a lot of layers of science, and there's a lot of ways to make perfect, but perfect doesn't meet reality. And so we've looked at what are the things that are doable, that are accessible from a mitigation perspective, that truly bend down the risk. But let me be very clear. You cannot fireproof a home. What we can do is significantly narrow the impact that will play out. And so this will go in 4 particular elements that I'll look at here. First of all, it is that need for a Class A fire rated roof. It's the largest surface that is in play. Now, you look at that and says, well, that could be a really expensive element on a home, and it could, but what the data has showed us is more than 99.5% of homes in California already have a Class A roof. And so while it would be a significant investment, it's an element that almost everyone has already met. We then look at elements that play out related to defensible space. And how do we get 5 impeccable feet? And I think about this in terms of what's under a deck that needs to be laid out in that space and ultimately enclosed. I look at elements related to the kind of landscaping that may be in place within that 5 feet. I look at elements including how gates that come up next to homes would play. But I think about this in a 3-dimensional way as well, because it deals with anything that would overhang into those 5 feet. And then clearly we need to make sure that the outbuildings are farther back. You know, the doghouse that's sitting right up under your eave becomes a fuel in these spaces. And there are a couple of building features, including the ember-resistant vents to make sure embers can't get in, and that bottom 6 inches, making sure that that is non-combustible. We look broader, though, because we know then that there are a set of things that would take you up to the next level. These plus elements you see on the screen are still essential in this space. They're very important, and they're the next layer. So all the orange elements, except for the roof, are not construction projects. There's something that a homeowner could do themselves. By the time we're doing the back-to-back fencing, siding that might be combustible, the roof eaves and how they could be enclosed, as well as what's under bay windows, upgrading decks, and paying attention to the elements of shutters that are there. This is an easier way to see that summary that is in place. But as we've began to go from ensuring that we have great science, which really has taken great advancements over the last 2, 3, and 5 years, how do we put that into practice so that people can do it? When we've done social science research in the West, Colorado and California particularly, we keep coming back to the California audience. People know they have a risk. They want to know what to do about it. They don't want to be left hopeless. And so I think as we look at these orange elements that are here, have the right roof, make sure that you have those resistant vents and the vertical non-combustible area at the base of the wall. Essentially, can you see the foundation element there? And then 5 impeccable feet in its most holistic way. Those are the pieces that are there. The biggest gap for people is landscaping. And we're working on some apps and ways by which people can do those reviews and understand that some of what we have come to understand in communities needs to change. I love this shot where you can see an area there up on the hill that is just now coming back after the fire. Yet we're in a place that clearly there, while beautiful, you have so much that is flammable right up next to the house. You'll go, well, will people actually make this change? Well, I'll tell you, 25 years ago, there were lawns in almost every yard across California, and drought-resistant landscaping came to become the norm. We now need to move to wildfire-resistant as well. That's the parcel, but we have to understand that each one of those homes is then situated in a neighborhood where these various pieces come together. And while you can maybe be able to perfectly address one parcel, you need to understand the concomitant effect, because oftentimes that's how the conflagration elements come into play, because those neighborhoods that are then just nestled up in that area. And so it's that reason that we are initiating some additional work looking specifically then at what was a wildfire prepared community. And we do believe that the elements of a fire-wise community or fire-safe councils are a required initial element that shows that there's organization and motivation. It then needs to turn to the severity in that, how neighborhoods collectively act, as well as the way by which fire suppression resources may be available. More suburban contexts, they tend to be more available than you might see in the more rural areas. And so initially our work on this will play out in California. People said, well, you do this elsewhere in the West? The answer is yes. But we need to start in this context. So in 2021, we're doing the development work on this wildfire prepared home. We'll move forward, hopefully with the home elements in 2022, and then bring the next layer in 2023. This is the kind of element that plays out by which we take the elements of what we know plays out in the physical world and work these relationships, work very closely with the modelers. You're going to hear from one of my colleagues, Michael Young, here in a moment, by which the data elements at wide scale can be brought together, and then look at the actions that can take place in an individual parcel and community level that ultimately will be reflected in the price that would be applied then to that risk. So much more that can be said in that, but I want to lay those elements out, look forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it to my colleague, Michael Young from RMS.
Thanks,
Roy.
Roy. Michael, I think you're going to be sharing your screen. And as you're doing that, let me remind all of our audience, and we have a number of people who are watching and listening to this presentation. We have a Q&A box here, and we're urging people to put in some questions that they would like to see the panel respond to. So please take advantage of that as we go along. Michael, it's all yours.
Great, thank you very much. Howard, it's my pleasure again. I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this seminar that you've arranged with all these esteemed colleagues. You're going to hear a little bit about a catastrophe model that we released last year. And a study that we recently did in partnership with IBHS and the NEIC, looking at trying to hang some numbers on how much some of the features that IBHS has been promoting with their wildfire preparedness program can move the needle. But in order to lay the ground, I want to explain a little bit about what a catastrophe model is and why we need to build catastrophe models for perils like wildfire, hurricane, and earthquake. And so this particular graphic here is one that I always use to kind of illustrate how, from an insurance perspective, traditionally the way prices have been set, I've been looking at past historical losses. But when past historical losses are rapidly changing, then the ability to forecast the future based on the past is very, very difficult. And what this is actually a compilation of US industry wildfire losses over the last 45, 50 years, from 1964 through 2020. And it's looking at basically 3 different eras, from 1964 to 1990, when the average loss for the insurance industry from wildfires was associated with less than $100 million per year. It went up 6 times in the period from 1991 to 2010. But in the last 10 years, that has gone astronomically larger to the level that, that's why Rob was describing this as, wildfire is now a primary peril, not a secondary or a tertiary or a earnings event any longer. And the reason why this is escalating like that, Rob's talked briefly about that earlier, but we've also been looking at this as well as, basically 3 things. You're building more houses in high risk areas, and that's the same reason why hurricane risk increases over time in the state of Florida as well. Climate change as well is a key driver of wildfire risk, because as you create more extremes in temperature and precipitation, you will create more conditions that will promote more wildfires occurring. And finally, how people respond to that through firefighting techniques or mitigation techniques will also change the perspective of wildfire risk. And we've seen changes in how we respond to fires that have been happening over the last 50 years. So what we've done is we've actually created a nationwide, continent-wide wildfire model. It covers all of Canada, the US. We've created 50,000 simulated years at a 50-meter resolution. That's one of the highest resolution models that we're bringing to market to date. And really, you have to think about it as a collection of individual fire models that are all defined at a regional resolution, something we call the fire weather zone. There are 98 of them in the US and 25 in Canada that we've developed. And really, for those of you that don't know what a catastrophe modeling framework is, it's basically got 5 different elements. First of all, we create a series of hypothetical events. In this case, 50,000 versions of next year, with over 7.2 million wildfires that we've generated hypothetically that could occur across the US. We then, for each one of those events, assign a footprint. So in this case, we've simulated the heat, the ember density, and the smoke characteristics associated with those. We then apply that to the exposure. So we figure out where the exposure and the hazard overlap. And this is a peril that is really, it's all about nipping at the edges of built environments, right? And that's why this kind of peril is requires super high resolution information in order to build a credible risk score associated with that. And then once you know which buildings are affected, you can now estimate the damage level and then estimate the economic losses associated with that and how much is borne by each of the different parties in the risk transfer food chain that Rob mentioned before. On that wildfire hazard modeling framework, there are 7 main components associated with this. And this is something that normally I take about an hour to kind of go through and talk about each one of these different things. In brief, what we've created is a series of fire weather simulations of the climate variables and the wind variables, and that's where we baked in the effects of climate change so far. Those drive fire ignition simulations, which are correlated with the urbanization patterns, like where people actually are, because most wildfires are actually created by human-related causes, whether it's power lines, accidents, campfires, so on and so forth. We then feed that into a fire spread model that actually pushes the fire around into different areas. And that's where we can actually figure out whether it goes into the urbanized area or not. On top of that, we do ember simulations, which are a key element, as Roy mentioned, in some of the simulations and the building research that IBHS has done. That's the key driver of most of the ignitability of structures in most cases. It's also the cause of urban conflagration, which is when structures start igniting other structures due to the proximity of the wildfire, such as what happened in Coffey Park in 2017. And then last but not least, we also do smoke simulations, which are something that are can have effects on health and also insurance claims over time. But the key point I want to leave with you today in my 10 minutes is really that most people think of wildfire as a burn scar, and as everything within that individual burn scar is completely gone. And that's usually what you see on the media. That's what you see on the news. And that's the common perception for most lay people. But when you actually look at the damage data of these incidents that have occurred in the last 10 years, 30 to 60% of the structures actually survived the wildfire. On the right-hand side is a map of the LNU complex that occurred in 2020, just north of Vacaville here in California. All the black crosses are structures that were partially damaged or destroyed. And all the blue crosses are the areas that were survived by Cal Fire. And you can see a large percentage of them are actually inside the fire footprint. So it's important that when you do these simulations, you take into account the hyperlocal activity associated with that. And the reason some of those structures survive is partially luck, but also partially because of the characteristics that IBHS has been promoting for the last 10 years through its research. And that's shown on the left-hand side. And this is actually the same exhibit of that graphic that Roy showed in his presentation. So what we've done in the study that we released in November of last year was we actually tried to quantify, well, how much do those individual characteristics reduce the overall risk? So now that we built our big fancy, 7 million wildfire simulation, what happens if we mitigate individual structures? And so what we did is we basically created hypothetical communities in 3 actual communities: Upper Deerwood in California, Berry Creek, and Oroville. We tried to pick high risk areas down to low risk areas, and then showed what the different positive and negatives are associated with putting all the good characteristics and the bad characteristics are on those individual buildings. And we've demonstrated that you can actually move the average annual loss by a factor of 30 to 70% in all 3 categories. Now, of course, the magnitude is directly related to the risk profile associated with that. So it's a much larger credit and debit associated with Upper Deerwood than it is for Oroville. And when you look at the results in more detail, we also compare the structural mitigations compared to the efforts of doing defensible space. Defensible space is something that the fire safe community has promoted very actively for the last 15 years. It's all about removing vegetation around structures. But if you did that independent of the structure mitigation, you would only be able to move the needle by about 15 to 20%, whereas the structural mitigation, the features of the wildfire preparedness program from IBHS, can move the needle by 30 to 60%. Now that actually means that there is a positive cost benefit ratio associated with these actions. We've demonstrated through this study, through these 3 hypothetical locations, that you can actually, the cost of mitigation is actually less than the expected reduction in average annual loss associated with that. What this table is showing you here is basically any number that is over 1 is where that reduction is positive. So it's a good thing to do. And the areas that are in white are basically areas where the money you're investing in that reduction might not be as effective, right? It will reduce your risk by that same amount, but it might not pay for itself within the different time zones that we're thinking about here, of the 10 to 50 year time frame. And with that, those are the final comments that I wanted to make. These were results that we've developed with our wildfire simulation model, which are just kind of the key talking points are summarized here. And you'll see that in the slides afterwards in the recording.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I think we're going to now turn to you, Rex, for your presentation. I think you're on mute at the moment, Rex.
Sorry about that.
Now we can hear you, but we can't see the presentation, but I think that's coming back on.
Okay, terrific. Grateful to join this group from rainy Northern California. Very happy to have some rain here. So my goal today is to give you the view from the market. And so I'll try in 10 minutes to cover the following things: how the perception by insurers of California wildfire risk has changed, which has already been mentioned a few times here, but yet the insurance pricing system did not change correspondingly, and how the lack of any change in pricing has led to an imbalance between risk and price that ultimately is impacting, at least in California, availability in the highest risk areas. But then talk about how the market has reacted in the last few years, particularly following the 2018 fire season, where we really started to see pretty significant market shifts, and then ultimately the role of mitigation in the marketplace today. So from the insurer perspective, homeowners insurance, if you look really from the early 90s, which this chart only goes back to 1996, but really from the early 90s through the early 2000s, homeowners insurance was a relatively stable business. Companies would operate on relatively thin margins that, when combined with investment income, led to making profitability targets. And then we went, and so on this chart, you can see this is a chart by year of industry-wide profitability. And if it's a green bar, that means the insurance industry made money. If it's a red bar, it means there was an industry loss. And the gray line shows you the cumulative result dating back to 1996. So you can see from 96 to 2003, the gray line shows that over that period of time, there was zero underwriting profit, but with investment income, it was fine. And then we went into a sustained period of year-over-year industry profitability. And significantly, starting around 2011, 2012, in California, we started seeing the impacts of a sustained drought that by the time we had the big fires in 2017, we had a significant period of drought that really set the stage for what has now become a multi-year pattern. Interestingly, starting in around 2013, 2014, the California Department of Insurance became so concerned about this pattern, they started sending letters to insurance companies, asking insurance companies why they shouldn't be forced under our rules here to lower their prices. And so in 2014, State Farm, the largest carrier out here, filed for a 6% increase. The Department of Insurance instead ordered their prices down 7% and ordered them to give a $75 million rebate to customers because they were making too much money. Really in the lead up to what State Farm had argued at the time, the risk is much bigger than you suggest. And then you see what started happening in 2017. And that's still a dispute that's active. It was just argued in a California appellate court 2 weeks ago, trying to resolve the rate level there. Obviously, in 2017, we had both Northern and Southern California profound fires. That's the first big red line. And just that 1 year significantly reduced industry-wide profitability from a high point in 2016. And then a second year of fires in 2018, you see where the industry financial result went. This does include the impacts of subrogation recoveries from the major utilities. And they actually came in 2020, which is why that's shown as a year of profitability, even though that particular year wasn't a negative year. That's when all the subrogation recoveries came in. So homeowners insurance has been mentioned, the wildfire component is now really a primary consideration and discussions among insurers, regulators, and reinsurers. Now, as this has changed, the pricing system has not changed for insurance companies. And the important thing is that insurance companies, they base their premium levels for catastrophic loss using historical loss experience. So the way California law works is an insurance company is not permitted to project its forward-looking losses by looking at their current portfolio. They have to look at their average of their losses in the past. So you can see leading up to 2017, it was very favorable experience. So we had a sustained period where companies could not achieve higher price levels under our price setting mechanism. So when you look at how California compares to the rest of the country in terms of average premium levels, knowing that this isn't even adjusted for cost of living. So once you adjust for California's much higher cost of living, these numbers are further out of whack. But you can see California is significantly under the United States average for average homeowners premium, and that over the 10-year period leading up to these 2018 numbers, which I wish there were more modern numbers, but this is the latest NAIC data. But the 10-year change leading up to 2018, California had increased premium by 16.4% over 10 years, while in the United States, that 10-year change was an average 42%. So you can see why, given the experience, all those green bars, the Department of Insurance, the Department of Insurance wasn't granting rate increases, even as companies were responding to research on climate change and drought and other things that could impact their loss scenario. In California, the rate setting mechanism just wasn't able to allow prices to increase. So by the time that these big fires started happening, insurance companies felt as if they were already in a hole. And so there's been quite a rush to get out of this hole. This is a bit of a messy slide, but the point of this is that projecting fire losses by or projected fire losses by historical losses, there are some problems with that approach. And certainly we advocate to allowing insurers to project their future losses using the tools that both Rob and Michael have already outlined, very sophisticated, where you can look at your actual portfolio, the conditions around the homes in your insurance pool, and then project losses based upon that. We're not permitted under California law to do that currently, so companies have to produce their rates based upon a simple average of their past losses. And it creates some dynamics that we don't understand why they would be attractive. For instance, if a company has a huge loss year, then they can justify much higher prices in their next rate filing at the very same time that they're non-renewing a bunch of people in their book of business, because the price level doesn't depend upon where your portfolio is. It just simply depends upon your past losses. And with modeling, obviously, you can project your losses in a much more sensible way, which is looking at where your risk is and you're insured in your contract levels, and then project accordingly. So as a result of having a pretty significant imbalance between the risk that carriers believe they face versus the price that they're permitted, our residual market mechanism, the FAIR plan, started to grow. And that's one, I think, accepted canary in the coal mine indicator for the health of the admitted market, which is language meaning just the regular insurance market. In California, there's a right to fire insurance. If you can't get it through a regular insurance company, you can go to the FAIR plan and they will write you a fire insurance policy that satisfies mortgage banks. And so you can see they have a odd fiscal year, October through September, but you can see 2014, 2015, 16, 17, and 18, pretty stable FAIR plan policyholder count in the 120,000s. And then in fiscal year 2019 is when we really start to see the admitted market reacting to 2 years of fires. So those fires, the latest fires happen in fall of 2018, and then you start seeing renewals of insurance companies well into 2019. And you can see really by May of 2019, that's when we started seeing the FAIR plan grow significantly, 3.8% in that first month of May, reaching its high point of growing 4.4% in a single month of July. And that's the time period most likely where the most significant non-renewals of insurance companies happened. And that trend started to ease in 2020. And then through 2021, we haven't had a month that even reached 2% growth. So there's some indication that the FAIR plan, that the immediate reaction to the 17 and 18 fires is past, and companies are starting to figure out how they want to approach this market, knowing they've already taken their underwriting actions that would reduce risk exposure that wasn't supported by their price. And then there's been, for the last couple of years, a trend of companies starting to seek rate increases so that they can then be able to go into higher risk areas. The current trend of the marketplace is indicated in this chart. what you see, this is just 6 companies representing 58% of the market. And you see the types of indications that they have under the historical loss method, which can produce, highly variable rate indications, meaning what they could justify under the rules. And so you can see these rate indications, anywhere from in the mid 30s all the way down to Allstate's the first company in the marketplace to have hit their cap as to what California law will allow them to do. But interestingly, for now, a majority of the market, there's either a filing that's pending, such as State Farm and Allstate have filings currently pending, or filings that have been approved, where we're starting to see the role of mitigation in the marketplace. And so as each company then comes to the Department of Insurance, for rate approval, the Department of Insurance has been pretty clear. They need to understand the benefits to consumers of granting the rate increase. And so filing by filing, you see increased eligibility and you see discounts at both the parcel and community level. The types of mitigation have really been led by Roy's group. IBHS has been really helping the insurance industry figure out a way forward. And as this slide indicates, carriers are eagerly awaiting the full wildfire prepared home research and ultimately incorporating that research into their market. The 3 things so far that are being recognized for mitigation: building year of the home. And we have a pretty well-regarded building code here for the WUI, known as Chapter 7A. So building in the Chapter 7A standards are generally recognized by companies. To date, parcel level actions consistent with IBHS's suburban roadmap are being included in company filings, and then quite a bit of attention to Firewise designations as well. And importantly, since the summer of 2020, every large carrier filing for a rate increase has included some form of increased mitigation or increased eligibility. So with that, I'll turn it over, I think, to Michael to end our formal presentations.
Thank you,
Rex.
And I think, Michael, you're on. Okay, I just want to make sure, and you're
Working on it here. There we go. All right. Well, thank you very much for including me today. I'm going to talk about, share a perspective about wildfire risk in California, and talk about recent research that we've done at Stanford that's focused on impacts across the broader real estate market. And I'll just say, in introducing this work, that we really conducted it because we want to motivate citizens and local governments especially to invest in the kinds of things that the other speakers have been discussing today. So I think the first thing is that, getting action on wildfire really requires reframing the challenge. And typically the challenge has been articulated in the public mind in terms of pictures like this from the Rim Fire that burned in 2013 and primarily in Stanislaus National Forest. Didn't destroy many structures, but did burn a lot of trees. And that's heightened by the fact that, when we see public communication from firefighting agencies, it tends to be in terms of numbers of fires and acres burned. But of course, for California, that's not really what we care about at this point. We care about structures and the destruction of communities, like the one in Paradise shown here, and the long-term impacts of the loss of structures, including the really extraordinarily bad homeless problem that has emerged in Chico, just downhill from Paradise, since the Camp Fire, when 20,000 people were rendered homeless overnight. We also in California are increasingly concerned about smoke and the impacts of smoke. Ongoing research at Stanford has shown a truly alarming rise in preterm births and also miscarriage rates during major smoke events in Northern California. And I think this is going to be a really important emerging air quality and environmental equity concern. You can just see here, that this is not just limited to California. This is 50 million people in the United States in 2020 living under conditions where, frankly, it's not safe to be pregnant. Traditional priorities around how we manage wildfire have typically focused on land management, and in particular, land management for timber. The campfire burned into paradise after making a 10-mile run across a fuels environment that had been managed for timber, then burned, and then replanted and probably mismanaged in terms of focusing on timber production. Timber production in the US on federal lands in 2018 produced about $267 million in revenue. That compares to estimates of smoke morbidity and mortality losses in California in 2018 of $31 billion, and real estate losses of roughly equivalent value. 29 billion was an estimate of both the insured and uninsured loss. So we need to really be rethinking how we prioritize different elements of this problem to try to get a handle on it. Recent work that we've conducted focuses on potential impacts in the real estate market. And this really stemmed, from our own experiences living in California and observing anecdotally what appeared to be trends in pricing, in the required activities necessary to put a home on the market in high wildfire risk areas, and the risks that transactions might fall through due to some of the concerns that Rex just discussed around availability and pricing of insurance. So shown here is one input to our model, which is the CoreLogic transactions database broken up by regions from 2001 to 2018. So this shows the transaction value of any home in the regions shown on the left and then plotted on the right. And you can see in it the lead up to the Great Recession, the decline in home values during and after the recession, and then the recovery after 2011 and up to the present. You'll also note that the San Francisco Bay Area really stands out in this data set. And we actually, because of the methodology that we're using that I'll discuss in a moment, had to exclude the Bay Area from our analysis because it's subject to such supply constraints that basically overwhelms any signal that might be in the data. Although, of course, there's a lot of the Bay Area that's extremely risky with respect to wildfire, and there's a tremendous amount of value at risk, as is shown by the purple plot in the purple line in this chart. So we took the CoreLogic transactions database and compared it to the most recent estimates of wildfire hazard potential from the U.S. Forest Service, and these are data that reflect fuels and topography and weather. This is not the best estimate of wildfire risk that exists, but it's probably the best publicly available data that exists. And I'm sure that some of the CAT modelers that are on this call have access to better information, but we're at a university and we don't have that. So we applied a pretty sophisticated methodology called synthetic difference and differences, which is a machine learning causal inference methodology to try to look at whether specific homes in high wildfire threat areas, in areas with wildfire hazard potential greater than 3, showed any difference in transaction value in the period after 2015, after the Valley Fire in particular, which is kind of a fire where that destroyed a significant number of structures, and many think of as the beginning of the intensification of wildfire behavior in California that's continued up to the present. To look at whether homes in that 3, 4, or 5 categorization were appreciating or changing in value differently than homes in the safer areas of the state where the majority of homes are located. And we did this analysis by census tract. So there's a lot of averaging happening here, right? It's going to blur out some of the heterogeneity and probably the differences, but it created still a data set that was tractable and where we had significant numbers of census tracts and transactions in high risk areas. Our methodology basically constructs a synthetic control for every transaction that occurs in one of these high risk tracts that allows us to make inferences about what it might have sold for were it located in a low risk tract. And this is what we find. Starting in around 2015, and I should say we've done sensitivity analyses with respect to the onset date of treatment, but starting in around 2015 and moving forward for the 3 years thereafter, there's about 7.5% less appreciation for high risk properties in California. Every home in California is increasing in value. The only question is how much and to what degree that might be due to wildfire risk and changing perceptions in the market, in a market of 40 million potential customers, right, of wildfire risk. And what we see clearly, and with very, we can be very confident in terms of the statistical significance of this result, is that there's about $50,000 less appreciation due to wildfire risk statewide for homes that are located in these higher risk tiers. We think this may be the first evidence of a kind of very large market perceiving a change in peril, the risk of a peril like this that we would associate with climate change, as has been discussed earlier. It's been shown the evidence for flood and flood risk is very mixed. There are some indications actually out of the Wharton Risk Center that the Miami-Dade County may be an emerging locus for sort of changing market perceptions around sea level rise. But certainly in California, we're observing this change, and I would expect, given the timing, that we might if we had data later than 2018, after the Camp Fire and the Woolsey Fire, that we might even see a larger magnitude of change, although the databases we have at the time we did the analysis didn't support that. We also evaluate whether the change we're seeing is roughly commensurate to differences in insurance pricing. So in essence, is the capitalized, the decrease in capitalized value, if translated into a mortgage payment, roughly equal to differences in insurance costs between high and low risk homes. And we find that it is, in fact, roughly commensurate. So the economics 101 version of this story appears to be borne out. But I would just emphasize that we have very, very rough estimates of that difference in insurance cost and the change in insurance cost through time. So what do we do? I think what this work shows is that we need to make major investments at scale in order to mitigate risk. We need major investments in home hardening and community protection, which has been discussed earlier in this webinar. We also need major investments in prescribed fire and changes in the approach to land management, so that we can reduce the incidence of fires, very high intensity wildfire that generates significant ember cast across communities. I'm going to just skip through these. They're in the slides, but we need home hardening, we need community protection, including community scale buffers. And we also need to think about restoring a natural fire regime in the forests in California that are burning at such high intensity. Here you can see an untreated patch and a treated patch after wildfire has passed through. And there's an obvious difference in the fire intensity and the degree to which the untreated patch is going to have flame lengths that generate very high intensity, rapid rates of spread, and embers blowing into communities. Part of this is going to be changing our legal relationship with nature, in the sense that, appreciating the fact that prior to Western conquest of California and the West, the Native American tribes engaged in significant land management in what we consider today to be the wilderness. And that's going to require a lot of change to get action on the ground at scale at a pace that's actually going to make a difference. So in conclusion, I would just emphasize that we need to focus on people and homes, not acres burned. We need to invest at the scale needed to achieve goals that we would like a reduced rate of structure loss, and also significantly improved air quality to avoid morbidity and mortality associated with smoke. And doing that is going to require building non-traditional stakeholder coalitions, which require quantifying the value of non-traditional avoided losses, of changes in the real estate market, avoided losses associated with home hardening, avoided losses associated with improved air quality if we can actually change the situation on the ground with respect to fuels. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Well, what a wonderful set of comments that all of the panelists made, raising lots of issues that I know are going to be the subject of discussion, not only possibly now for a brief period of time, but after this webinar. Before we have a few questions that have been raised by our participants. I wanted to first make sure that if anyone had a comment, a final comment they wanted to raise from as part of the panel, they could raise their hands. Otherwise, I'm going to raise one question here for them, and then we'll turn to some of the questions from the others. Okay. Well, my question is one that is really linking up the theme of this whole session, which is mitigation and insurance. And the challenge, I think, is that insurance offers an opportunity for individuals to mitigate for points that I think several of you raised, and I know you specifically raised, Rex, in terms of sort of how that might actually play a role, but everyone turned to that. And I'm wondering if there are any data on how successful that has been with respect to the notion of more people and homeowners investing in mitigation, and also in communities where there's a possibility for the community then to provide maybe even encourage discounts on insurance premiums, to tie the two together. Anyone like to comment, or several of you want to comment on that? I just want to raise that as I think an issue that we're all struggling with. How do we bring the two together, which everyone in this panel has talked about in one form or another? What kind of data do we have at all in terms of how well that has actually worked in practice? Rex, do you want to give at least a thought on that? And I see a hand up from someone, but maybe it was you, Rex. But if you could say something, and maybe a couple of other people may want to tune in, or we'll go to some of the other questions.
You bet. I'm happy to start. And insurers have been, frankly, fairly desperate for settled data on which they could rely for California wildfire risk. There has been such worry that what happened in Florida following significant reforms in the marketplace, where there were efforts to impose certain mitigation discount requirements on companies, that not all companies were sold, that they were the right discount levels, that we not get into a situation in California that replicates that. And so there's been a worry that, because of course policymakers are going to respond to individuals who want to feel individual control over their outcomes, that there would be a pressure on insurers to start having all sorts of offerings that allow people to control their destiny, whether that's doing certain mitigation items to guarantee them issuance of a policy, or to get a specific discount. And so I think Roy has felt the anxiety placed on him, because our members and others have been pressuring IBHS to come up with usable things that can be incorporated into the marketplace. And so as to effectiveness, I don't think we have any doubt about the strength of the research IBHS is doing. And I certainly think that once we have this certification mechanism, which I don't know that Roy necessarily described how their process will work, but once policyholders and applicants have the ability to have a sort of a certification of mitigation that they can shop around to different companies, I think you'll see companies incorporating the research into their rating and probably underwriting, but that's yet to be determined.
Okay. Roy, I don't know whether you want to make a quick comment, and I know we have points for Rob and Michael, and both Michaels would like to raise.
I'll defer to others, because in each one of these cases, the science that we're putting out is actually getting picked up by a number of these players and translated. So I'll defer to them.
Okay. Rob?
Sorry, I'll be brief. Howard, I think it's too early to tell from the perspective of the mitigating efforts and the impact that they have, because when you write insurance coverage, at least in my world in the reinsurance area, you write it with the intent of a long period of time where the catastrophic risks only occur once in a long period of time. And the other thing that's hard to prove is when the mitigating effects come into play as to whether it was dumb luck or whether it was actually the mitigating effects that made the change for the wildfire loss not to occur. And to Rex's earlier point, I think that the data will tell and the timing will tell. Unfortunately, it's slower than any of us would like it to be.
But hopefully it will occur in the future. That's the
Yeah, I'm not saying it won't occur. I'm just saying that it's insurance is very, very complex between capital providers, regulators, insureds, et cetera, court systems. There's a lot of factors and a lot of play, and unfortunately, it takes time.
And causes, of course, where the actual losses came from also enters into that picture. That's also a challenge. Michael Warr and then Michael Young.
Sure. I would just hold up. I totally agree with what's been said so far with respect to how risk mitigation may or may not connect in an actuarial sense to the price of insurance or the availability of insurance that any homeowner pays. I think it's a very complicated technical problem to make that connection right now that we need to do more science on. But what I would say is that I think there are some examples actually from this fire season where we saw the value of investment in community scale mitigation. In particular, I would point people to Christmas Valley in South Lake Tahoe, where a decade after the Angora fire, which scared the crap out of everyone in South Lake Tahoe, destroyed about 300 homes, I believe, if memory serves. There was a decade spent doing fuel treatment, reducing fuels in the community in a very widespread way. And that allowed two things to happen. As the fire burned off of Echo Summit and was showering embers down onto South Lake Tahoe, firefighters could stay in place and put out spot fires. And they could also feel safe putting dozer lines around the community, because as the fire burned down at high intensity toward Christmas Valley, once it hit the fuel treatments, it dropped onto the forest floor and was reduced in intensity. Flame lengths dropped substantially. And I think, how that fits into insurance pricing at the state level is a very complicated question. But in terms of showing, what homeowners in Christmas Valley care about is their homes are still there. Whether they got a $20 discount on their homeowners coverage or a $40 discount, that might matter, and it's an important question at the state level. But we need to be doing this to keep communities intact in California. And there is so much value in that at this point, given the losses over the last several years, that I think it's important to make this connection to the pricing of risk as an argument for doing it. But I guess I think we're also seeing evidence that this can work, and it can work at scale when there is concerted community-wide effort.
I think that's a really important point. And of course, your example with Montecito being another one that I mentioned earlier are examples of where you have had a fire and then the next thing you know, things are done. But it took the fire, and it would be nice to do some of that beforehand if you could, but you're absolutely right. Those are the things that actually go forward. Michael Young, you had a comment, and then I want to turn to a couple of the questions that have been posed.
Sure. Yeah. So this is one of the things that this industry is going to struggle a little bit with, is the waiting for perfect, waiting for great when you have good already, right? There is already pretty strong, clear, statistically robust evidence, like the plots that I'm showing, like, the survivability of structures goes up when you do some of the structural mitigation things that are within the neighborhood. Those are absolutely critical to do, and you can't ignore that or wait until you have some kind of perfect walled garden scenario associated with, kind of fuel reduction. Because that's what the focus has been in the last 20 years, right? And that's not necessarily, that will change the probability of a fire occurring, but you also have to prepare for the inevitability that if you are in a high fire area, there is going to be a fire, right? So now the trick is when you take some of the things that we're learning from IBHS, one of the things that you don't want to do like they did in Florida, and I was involved in the original studies that established some of those wind mitigation credits in Florida, is you don't want to force the industry to give credit for something that already exists, right? So Class A roofs, we know from the research that IBHS is doing and other parties, NFPA, absolutely critical. It's built into the Chapter 7A, building code, right? You don't want to set up a system where everyone gets a 50% credit from doing a Class A roof and they're already there. Because what have you done? You've actually just stopped people from moving beyond that. Once they get 50% credit, they're like, oh, that's good. I don't need to actually do the vents. I don't need to do the 5-foot zone. I don't need to do the vegetation. What's the point of doing that, right? So you got to be very careful about how you set this up. And this is exactly what the regulators in the insurance industry need to think about and when they create and draft these individual things.
Thank you. That's a very important point. I want to turn to a question I think that that I know you may want to comment on, Roy, for the group. And this is a question from Adam Thiel, where it says, there doesn't appear to be as much concern within the academia and insurance industry about addressing the fire problem in the urban context versus the rural suburban WUI setting. And how do you understand why that might be the case? So Roy, if you'd like to comment on that.
First of all, I appreciate the question from Adam. For those of you who don't know, he is the fire commissioner for the city of Philadelphia and understands fire and broader emergency management really as well as anyone does. Obviously, today's conversation is on the wildfire side. IBHS partners with NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, and others on what this looks like in an urban residential context. They do some really exceptional work in that space. I think one of the key differentiations is when we get this conflagration or this kind of domino effect where you lose hundreds of homes as opposed to something that can be a bit more isolated. But I appreciate him raising the question because it's something that really demands more attention and conversation and maybe even a forum like this because we see the fires in that urban context all too often disproportionately hitting underserved portions of the community. And so I appreciate the question.
Good, thank you. Here's a question from William Lull. Do you cover off-grid homes? What is the impact of avoiding the electric distribution risk? I'm not quite sure exactly what that means, but maybe one of you could maybe interpret that and maybe respond to it.
Well, I think if I can take a first grab at it, each provider has to make decisions about where they want to offer cover and on the grid, off the grid. But I want to pull this application to ignition. Yes, there have been very clearly documented places where the electrical transmission lines were the cause of ignition. But then you look at 2020, and the majority of the fires in California were started by dry lightning. And so we need to collectively pay attention to all the ignition sources. There's a set of these things that are Mother Nature. They say that they get beyond the man-made side of the equation. So we need to holistically look at it. And we need to be working towards a place that says when ignition occurs, how can we narrow the path of damage? Because there's not a pathway to put an iron dome over California and says there will be no wildfires.
Roy, could you just say a word about what the meaning is of on the grid and off the grid for everyone?
Oftentimes this speaks to people who are directly tied to the major transmission lines for electrical purposes. It can have a few other applications. I chose to walk down this path to make sure that we appreciate that there are plenty of natural ignitions.
I'm going to take one more question and then we'll have to end this. And this is from Katie Oren, and interested in how has the moratorium on insurance companies dropping homes within the next fire impacted zip codes for 1 year? And how is that actually impacted on FAIR Plan enrollment? I assume that might be something, Rex, that you may want to comment on since you talked about the FAIR Plan.
You bet. There's a relatively new law in California that says communities affected by a fire or near a big fire cannot be non-renewed by an insurance company for 1 year after the big fire. And so now we've gone through a couple years of this to see what the impact would be. And the first sort of roll off of a 1-year moratorium was early December of 2020. And so we certainly were watching the FAIR Plan numbers very closely to see whether there would be a wave of non-renewals in these areas that then hit the FAIR Plan. We haven't seen that pattern to date. And, while the insurance industry generally bristles at restrictions on underwriting decisions, we did work with the legislator on that particular legislation to come up with this current moratorium approach. I think companies have accepted this reality, but we haven't yet seen it really impact the FAIR Plan.
Thank you, Rex. And let me mention one other that Dana Talihon, I don't have the right pronunciation, but it's in the question on whether landslide movements are covered. And Rex did respond to that in the Q&A by saying that property insurance does not typically cover landslide movement unless the movement is caused by a previous fire. So I just want to let people know that some of these questions have been answered. Let me extend my thanks and I hope you join me in virtually to this panel. What a remarkably diverse but actually consistent set of presentations here to highlight the fact that we had better pay attention to this wildfire problem, and we better pay attention to it now by trying to figure out ways that we can not only reduce the risk, but to bring climate change into the picture in a very explicit way to say that things are not going to get better and they may get considerably worse. And we really have to figure out the role that mitigation and insurance, individual homes and communities can play to deal with this. And obviously state legislatures and the federal government have to play a key role as part of that. And we know property values may be affected by this, as we actually heard at the end of the presentation, Malcolm. So it is something that will continue to play a key role. There will be a video and there will be a recording of all of this made available in a few days for those of you who would like to see what has been said or hear what's been said. And we hope with this stimulates a real dialogue among a number of other people. And I can say to end that the Wharton Risk Center would like to be at the center of this because we feel it's such a critically important problem. And so I want to thank everyone again. Carolyn Kuski and Bob Meyer, also thank you for being part of this dialogue. Take care.